Um, Jim Steinback is our, as most of you realize, and we're going to talk about using the Croak Book. I love the name. I think that's hilarious, and thank you for putting it together, Jim, and then taking us through it today. For those of you who don't know, Jim was former president and owner of, is it Magnaraft Electric? Magnacraft Electric, okay, which was eventually sold to Square D, and he's had numerous board positions for both for-profit and not-for-profit. Went to the University of Wisconsin, MBA from the University of Chicago. Probably most relevant to our discussion today is he's married with sons and grandchildren, taking the time to really understand how to organize our affairs. So that's what he's going to talk about today. And Jim, with that, I'm going to just turn it over to you and let you run.
Thank you, Debbie. And my thanks to all of you who are on this call for being willing to discuss a topic that hardly anybody ever likes to discuss. To begin with, I'm not an author. I'm an L3er like you, who because of circumstance has been either an executor or a trustee 5 times. And even though all 5 had professional estate plans, I'm here to say that 3 of them left behind an organizational mess. And none even had something as basic yet as important as a personal balance sheet. And I say that even though several had been reading financial statements every month for most of their adult lives. But because there wasn't a balance sheet, before I could follow the instructions in their wills, I had to identify their assets, find out how they were titled, find out where they were kept, and find out what they were worth. One of the 5 had 4 bank accounts and 4 brokerage accounts, even though one of each would have been enough. And because a couple of those brokerage accounts were dormant, it took me nearly a year to locate all of them. And then lastly, all 5 had homes that had not been titled to living trust, which meant those assets had to go through probate before their heirs could take title. And the value of those homes went into the public record, which is bad news, because the unintended consequence was that it made the heirs a potential target for the dishonest, because dishonest people pay attention to what comes through the probate system. And I'm constantly amazed by how many smart people put their homes in joint tenancy instead of a trust. So I came to realize that an estate plan is by itself insufficient. And I promised myself that when my time came, our trustee would find everything in one place and everything would be as up to date and as simplified as I could make it. And I call that place the Croak Book, because that's what my wife Joanne and her advisors will turn to about 7 to 10 days after I croak. The Croak Book is a little about tax avoidance, but mostly it's about making an effective transition from you being in charge of your assets to someone else being in charge, most likely your spouse and her advisors. And in that sense, I consider it really a gesture of love from you to your partner. But in spite of the benefits, I've seen 2 obstacles preparing a Croak Book that come up over and over. One is just ordinary procrastination, but the other is the difficulty that many have, guys especially, in contemplating their own mortality. Whenever I presented it, at least one gentleman says to me that he already has 80% of it done. He just needs to put it all in one binder. Well, that's nonsense, because it's not just putting wills and trusts in a binder. And if that guy were to die tomorrow, his wife and heirs wouldn't know 10% of what needs doing, much less 80%, because wills and trusts are the least important components of your Croak Book. On top of which, your Croak Book isn't static. It needs to be reviewed every year. Our assets change. Their values change. Our passwords change. Our feelings about life support change. The cast of characters in our families change. Grandchildren get added. Son-in-laws maybe come and go. Daughter-in-laws maybe come and go. And our advisors change or predecease us. So by necessity, the quote book has to be updated at least once a year. One of the biggest benefits of having a quote book is that it's motivated me to simplify. We now have an absolute minimum number of bank accounts and brokerage accounts, and the quote book deserves a credit. We now have one life insurance policy instead of several, and the quote book deserves the credit. And every year I ask myself if our investments are age appropriate, and every year I shift more of them into things that are easy to manage, and every year I have less that require my oversight, and the quote book deserves the credit. And every year I update our balance sheet, and I make sure the values are accurate but conservative, which I'll explain in a moment. And the quote book deserves the credit for that too. So let me give you an example. Imagine that you died 9 days ago, and you were your family's main economic contributor. So now it's the morning of the 10th day, and that morning your spouse gets a phone call. The call is from your estate attorney, who says that he needs her help in putting together an inventory of all your assets and liabilities and their values for estate tax purposes. My question to you is, could your spouse pull up a current balance sheet, listing your assets and liabilities and their values? And would it make clear which assets were owned by you, which by her, and which are in trust? And then, because this balance sheet will be used to value your estate and thereby determine the inheritance tax, will the values listed be as low as possible? Remember, this is for estate tax purposes. So even if it pains you to do it, for everything except listed securities, you should deflate those valuations as much as you can. And who's best equipped to do that? Not your accountant, not your spouse, not your trustee. You are. Let me tell you about a personal experience. In 1978, my dad died. His accountant and friend valued his company and then filed a preliminary estate tax return along with a substantial sum of money. I thought the valuation was too high. So I looked up the PE ratios of every public company that had a division that made something similar to what we made. And when we filed the return, the final return, I insisted we use the number that came from my research, which, by the way, the IRS accepted. A little while later, I got a letter that said I could go to the Federal Reserve Bank in Chicago to collect our refund. And by the way, this was 1978, when an upper bracket home in the Chicago suburbs was maybe $125,000. So I went there, and I identified myself, and two giggling women handed me a check for a little over $400,000, and both proposed marriage. I'm serious. And one was pretty cute. But I declined, and as a result, my mom, who was the primary beneficiary, had $400,000 more than she would have had. So I have strong feelings about those of us who have our own businesses or closely held securities, doing our own valuations. That's our job. And for the sake of our families, we need to do our job and not let somebody else do it after we're gone. One thing I know for sure is that your will isn't going to help your spouse answer this question. And my guess is that unless you've prepared a personal balance sheet, for most of you, your spouses wouldn't know how to answer this question. Some of you may think that they ought to know, but my guess is they don't know. But if you want to find out, ask them to make a list of your combined assets and liabilities and their values. and see if their answers are even close to how you would have answered. Afterwards, if you decide there's got to be a better way, then let's do a quote book. Okay, I've said a lot, so before we get to the individual sections of our quote book, let me just pause and see if there are any questions. Okay.
I have a question, but there's some interference and background noise. It's a little bit distracting. I don't know if anyone else can hear that.
Yeah, there is a little bit of scratching around. If everybody maybe could mute so that we don't take any chances on the background noise. Thanks.
Go ahead, Vicki.
No, that was it, Jim. I don't have a question. I was just that background noise was kind of distracting.
Okay.
So I'm paying rapt attention to this.
So, Ashley, first slide, please.
Ron Feinstein, I have a question.
Sure.
Let's say that you have a very large value of artwork, and you put low values on it. Is there some personal record that you should also put the actual values on it, making the assumption that the family would have no clue if a painting or a sculpture was worth $1,000 or $50,000?
I would say yes, Ron. You wouldn't be the first person to have two sets of financials, and all I'm advocating is that the financials for estate tax purposes should be as low as possible.
So some kind of an instruction to the family that this is a personal note not to be shared when it comes to that aspect of it.
That's right.
Okay.
You can also give them a recommended name of an art evaluator or whatever it may be that they can turn to. Because the problem here is the stagnant nature of valuations, and unless you're going to go and value it every year, I doubt you would get your sculptures or your artwork done. So sometimes you can just put in the name of a trusted appraiser they can turn to get a valuation for selling purposes, for instance.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Hardy. So, first slide.
Jim?
Yes?
Hi, it's Bonnie. I have a comment / question. You're talking about this as if there's one person of a family or a couple or a partnership who is in charge of doing all this. What is your feelings about and your recommendations about at this time when we still, God willing, have our partners, that the partners work on this together so that each of them knows everything at the same time?
I would endorse that. If it's in your situation, that's attainable. In a lot of cases, it's not, and just getting one person to do it is difficult. But if you can do it with your partner, then more power to you, yes. I think it would have more value. That was never the case in my family. Okay, I'm going to go on. Section 1. Section 1 in our quote book are the letters. My letter to Joanne, hers to me. And this is the place where I give guidance to Joanne at a time when she might be overwhelmed. In my letter, I inform her who our advisors are and our obligations and non-obligations with respect to our children. It summarizes our life insurance coverage and how to claim it. It summarizes our Social Security and retirement assets and tells her how to claim them. It identifies all bank and brokerage accounts. It tells her where she'll find the titles to our residences as well as a summary of the improvements to those residences. It summarizes by account our common stocks and other investments, along with the names and phone numbers of the people to call if she wants to sell anything. And then lastly, it directs her to whom to give my personal effects, and it even identifies those who I want to be my pallbearers and those who I'd like to see speak at my funeral. Section 1 also contains the business cards for our estate attorney, our CPA, our trustee, and our life insurance agent. These have changed over the years, and keeping those business cards current in the Croak book is just me showing common courtesy to Joanne. Section 1 also contains a list of all my passwords, not for every website I've ever bought stuff from, but the important ones. And if you want to use it as a reference, a scrubbed version of my letter to Joanne is in the Croak book that's now on the L3 website. And again, almost none of this information is likely to be in your will. I consider this letter to be an essential and key component of anyone's Croak book. So let's pause and see if there's any questions about the letter, the spousal letter. Any questions?
Jim, this is Paul Robshaw. I work on that letter all the time to update it, but would just have a suggestion that I added to my Croak book is a letter to my siblings and a letter to my children.
Even better. I haven't done that, but I like that. Okay, next slide.
Okay. I'm going to just, we've got a lot of scratching around still, so if you could all just be really cautious about where you are relative to the phone and or just mute. Thanks.
Next slide, Ashley. Section 2 contains the closing documents for our two homes, including the deeds. It also has a summary page of what each cost and a spreadsheet of how much we've spent on capital improvements during the years that we've owned them, and I'll explain why in a second. Both are titled to trust. Neither is in joint tenancy. So, why do I keep a spreadsheet on the capital improvements that we've made to each home? Well, the law says that your basis in your primary residence is the original cost plus all improvements minus the gains on all your prior residences, which up to now have been tax deferred. So when you sell your house and do the math, the first $500,000 of gain is exempt for a couple filing a joint return. But your house may have appreciated by more than that, maybe a lot more, especially since the calculation requires you to subtract from the cost of your house the gains on your prior residences, which may be worth substantial. Therefore, it's important to keep track of every dollar spent on home improvements. You want your basis to be as high as it can be, because paying a capital gains tax just because of poor record keeping is just dumb. And I know you didn't get to where you are in this world by being dumb. So document those improvements. If you haven't been doing this, then go through your house room by room and remind yourself of the capital improvements you've made over the years, and put that summary in Section 2 of your Croak book. But going forward, start a spreadsheet for your home improvements and save the invoices. Let me just tell you briefly how I think of capital improvements. If Joanne and I buy furniture or an area rug, those aren't capital improvements because we can take them with us when we move. But if we put in a new floor or built-in cabinets or a new water heater or a new furnace or a new window or a new door or a major appliance or even custom drapes, then those costs go on my spreadsheet. If I have the gutters clean, that's maintenance. But if I replace the gutters, that's a capital improvement. A new roof is a capital improvement. If the yard service cuts my grass, that's maintenance. But if we put in a new patio and new landscaping, That's a capital improvement. So to sum up, Section 2 has everything needed to sell our home and keep the capital gains tax to a minimum. And as with each chapter in your Croak book, this is a moving target that you need to keep up to date. And by the way, how much of this information is in your will? That's right, 0. Now oftentimes, people ask me, why bother with a spreadsheet if upon death, the basis in your home automatically steps up to market value? Well, that's correct. It does. But owning your home until the last to die has died hardly ever happens. More likely, you and your spouse will decide that as empty nesters, the house is too big, and you'll sell it and move into something simpler. Or at some point, you'll die, and within a year or two, your spouse will decide the house is too big and move into something simpler. In both cases, there is no step up, and there will be a capital gain and maybe a tax. This is why you need the spreadsheet. Okay. Any question about what's just been said about residential assets?
Jim, this is Hardy. I want to differentiate here. Typically you want your estate to be as small a value for the purpose of estate taxes.
Correct.
But you're advocating keeping an accurate, up-to-date, enhanced value of your home, not for estate purposes, but for when the home is sold by your surviving spouse. Is that what I'm hearing?
No, incorrect.
Okay.
I'm advocating that you document your improvements so that the true basis in your home, the true investment that you've made in your home, is reflected in your Croak book, so that when it does sell, there is the smallest possible differential between what it sells for and what you've invested, thereby resulting in the smallest possible capital gains tax, if any. Have I helped that? Have I helped answer that?
I have a question as well.
Go ahead.
Does one need certificates of capital improvement forms to accompany all that? Or if you don't have it, still record it?
I have a spreadsheet and I have the invoices, and that's sufficient. If my estate tax return is ever challenged, the invoices are there to back it up. It's unlikely it would ever be challenged, but if it is, I have the invoices, and that's sufficient.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, next slide, please. Section 3. Section 3 contains one balance sheet for Joanne and me. I list her assets separately from mine, but they're all there. For her living trust and mine, I show the EIN numbers, and I list individually the assets in each trust. For the brokerage account, I show the institution and the account number. Ditto for the bank account. This is the place for you to check if everything you own is titled to a trust, so as to avoid probate. In our case, everything we have is titled to a trust except our vehicles. And as we replace them, I'm retitling those also, so that when we're dead, our trustee can easily dispose of them without having to spend hours at the DMV applying for a new title, which I've had to do a couple of times. This is also the place to look over your investments and ask yourself if the risk associated with each of your investments is age appropriate, and if they can be properly managed by your spouse or your heirs once you're no longer around. And then finally, let me say, as a 5-time trustee, I think the spousal letter and the consolidated balance sheet are by far the two most important components of your Croak book. And after those, I put the summary of capital improvements. If you don't have a personal balance sheet for you and your partner. Then do one this week. Play with the format. Make it concise, but complete. I predict that every time you come back to it, you'll see a way to make it better. Eventually, it'll be perfect. And someday your heirs and your trustee will send up a prayer of thanks with your name on it. Okay, any questions about the balance sheet?
Jim, this is Hardy. I use a financial advisor / CPA that produces an annual financial statement and also provides as a resource for Karen to explain assets and where they are. Again, that's somewhat of a delegation of my responsibilities. I understand that, but the continuing update of financials, it just, there's new partnerships, there's new LPs and structures like that. I found that using a financial advisor, not just an accountant, but one that's actually a financial advisor and prepares my financial statement has been helpful. Is that in contrast to what you're suggesting?
If you're providing the values of the assets and you've made them as low as you can make them, recognizing that this set of financials is for estate tax purposes, then I'm fine with that. I think that works just as well as what I do. But keep the valuations low. Any other questions? So next, Section 4 is for our kids. In our case, it contains copies of trusts we set up years ago for our sons, which they now manage. I also keep their birth certificates in this section. Section 5 contains our one and only life insurance policy. I don't want to get into the pros and cons of having life insurance. I'll just say that we originally had several policies because when we were a young couple, I thought it was responsible to buy life insurance. And over the years, I had accumulated several policies. A few years ago, I brought them all to our agent, and I told him to consolidate them into one policy, which is what we did, and which, of course, is titled to a trust. And if you have multiple policies, you might consider doing the same, because the best estate plan, by far the best, is the one in which everything has been simplified as much as possible. Section 6 has to do with philanthropy.
He hasn't taken the slides.
In our case, it has the documentation for a modest philanthropic trust, which requires us to give away a set amount every year. Next slide, please, Ashley. And now that we're talking about trust, this is a good place to pause and mention that at the front of each section that contains a trust, I have a one-page summary of that trust. We only have a couple of trusts, but for what we have, each summary identifies 7 components. The date it was created and the date it'll terminate. The name of the trustee and the name of the beneficiaries. The purpose of the trust and what's in it or will be in it. And the EIN number, which is the federal tax ID. That's it. This is basic information. And I'd argue that if you can't write such a page for each of your trusts, then you probably don't understand your own estate plan. So please, do those summaries and make sure you do. Any questions about how to summarize the trust? Okay, next slide, Ashley. Thank you. Section 7 is my will and trust plus any amendments, and of course the summary page. Section 8 contains the same for Joanne. By the way, that's it for our wills and trusts, Section 7 and 8. 2 chapters out of 12. That's it. Section 9, and next slide, contains medical and property durable powers of attorney for Illinois and Colorado, because Joanne and I split our time between both states, and something could happen to us in either one. It also contains a great little document called the 5 Wishes, which is America's most popular living will. And it spells out how much or how little medical treatment we each want at the end of our lives. We've done this because a medical power of attorney gives authorization to someone to make medical decisions on our behalf if we can't make them for ourselves. But the 5 Wishes informs that someone how you would be making those decisions if you could. It's a good document because it makes you think. And it's an important complement to the medical power of attorney. And again, that power of attorney gives authority to someone else, but it doesn't tell that someone else how to use that authority in a way that reflects your wishes. Next slide, Ashley.
Hey, Jim, a question on that. Where
Yes.
did you get the information to fill out the 5 wishes?
Just Google 5 Wishes. It will come up immediately.
Okay, thanks.
Section 10 is for our retirement assets. This is where I keep the most current statements for our retirement accounts. IRAs, 401ks, KEOs, which I put there every month. Plus, I put there those Social Security benefit summaries that get mailed to each and every one of us every few years. Maybe most importantly, our marriage certificate is also in Section 10, because one of us will have to present it in order to claim the other's accounts. If, like me, you can't find your marriage certificate, then pay the $25 and get a duplicate from the county clerk for the city in which you were married, because absolutely, positively, one of you is going to need it. Okay, I'll pause again. Any questions about late in life and end of life considerations like retirement assets, powers of attorney, and living wills?
Now, Jim, this is Debbie. That begs one other question, because you talked about having copies of your marriage certificate in here. We've always had copies of things like that that need to be notarized, or like the originals of titles to cars and things like that, in our safety deposit box. Can you talk a little bit about how you reconcile that? Do you have them in both places, or what do you just here?
So, Debbie, does your trustee have you made your trustee, given your trustee authority to go into your safe deposit box?
Well, each other does, but if we went together, no.
Well, then nobody's ever going to be able to get into it.
Yeah.
So there should be some backup to yourself and your partner. And in our case, we keep it in a fireproof box in our home. So, and our trustee knows exactly where that is. We don't have a safety deposit box, and I don't think we need one. Okay, Section 11, and next slide,
Jim?
please. Yes, sir.
Jim, this is Hardy. We have an in-floor safe, but the problem with those, if you ever have a fire, they douse your house with water, and guess where it all goes? To the lowest floor of the house, which is it's one of those things which you need to make sure if it's a document you're going to be keeping is not only safe from fire but also from water produced to put those fires out. So so you got to put it so it's not at the very lowest part of your home. That's where all the water runs to.
Here's what we've decided. None of these documents that I'm talking about have any value to a thief. So we just keep them in a fireproof container. It's unlocked. It's not bonds. It's not funds. It's not stock certificates. It's nothing fungible. So we just keep ours in a fireproof container, and our trustee knows exactly where that is. Okay.
Yeah, Jim, this is Paul again. I'm struggling with executor trustee issues. I am in a second marriage with children from previous marriages, and had my wife as the executor trustee of everything, and discovered that could be massive conflicts with my family. And she found the same thing. So we're trying to determine who would be a decent executor, decent trustee. Do you have any thoughts on that?
You want it to be someone that all your heirs respect. You want it to be someone that's absolutely trustful, someone who's sophisticated, someone who's roughly a half a generation younger than you, and who's willing to do the job, which might be difficult. And a trustee's job can go on for a long time, because if you've got your trust set up so that they pay out until your heirs are a certain age, then that trustee's job could be years and years and years. I'm sympathetic to your situation, because finding that kind of person is not easy.
Well, to your point, the trustee sounds like a bigger job than the executor. If you've done a good job on your estate, the executor is just carrying out all the instructions, right?
If you have everything titled to a trust, there is no need for an executor. Only if your assets or some of your assets are titled to you individually do you need an executor. But as long as you take my advice and have everything titled to a trust, there's no need for an executor.
Mm-hmm. I've done a lot of that.
Jim.
Yes, sir.
This is Whitey. Are you saying title to the trust, but you're talking about prior to death, right?
That's right. Living trust.
Right. And is that that sounds cumbersome at first blush. In other words, that having all of that, everything you own in a trust, do you find that cumbersome at all?
Not at all.
Administratively?
No, not at all. Not at all. It simplifies things. I'll tell you why in a moment. But you set it up; it's revocable, so you can change what's in there. You can change the language. You make yourself as beneficiary. It's everything that it has all the values of owning something individually and more. The single biggest plus is that we haven't spent much time on this, but it avoids probate court. In probate court, every asset that you have titled individually will go through probate, which is something you want to avoid, because the average length of time in probate is 8 months to 2 years. And that means that your heirs can't access your assets for that period of time, which may put them in financial hardship, some of them. Secondly, everything about your estate plan goes into the public record. You don't want that. Thirdly, it's costly. There's legal fees, there's court fees, and it can consume up to 5% of your estate. You don't want that. And fourth, like in Paul's case, where there is a second marriage and children involved with each, you want to make sure that your estate plan is very specific about who inherits what. Not just, let's say there's 2 kids from a first marriage and 2 from a second. You don't want to just say each of them gets 25%. You want to specify what assets go to whom, so that you avoid the heirs squabbling in probate court, which, by the way, the lawyers love. And 2 squabbling heirs or more can dissipate an estate faster than you can say $500 an hour. So that's something that you want to be quite clear about. particularly if your family situation is complex.
Thank you.
All the reasons for having trust. Okay. Next slide. Section 11. Section 11 is easy. It contains all vehicle titles. These are always a pain in the neck for a trustee to find, so we've put all of ours in the Crook Book. And as mentioned, I'm now retitling them to our trust as they turn over. Next slide is for Section 12, which is our final section. And fittingly, it's about funerals. It contains what our children need to know about our memorial service and our cemetery plots. In our case, we've already bought the plots, and we've prepaid for the caskets and the memorial service for each of us. I know that probably sounds anal, because it is anal, but experience has made me anal, and that's what we've done, and those contracts are in this section. The cemetery plots are real estate, and like all real estate, they have deeds, and the deeds are in this section. Here again, I've identified my pallbearers and those who I'd like to speak at my memorial service. All this is in Section 12. So that's our Crook Book. I refer to it frequently. Every time I make an investment or liquidate an investment, I update our balance sheet. Every time I look at the balance sheet, I ask myself if the investments are age appropriate. I can't further reduce the number of bank and brokerage accounts we have or further consolidate our life insurance, but having the Crook Book is what motivated me to do what I've already done. And a couple of times a year, I update the amount shown for the improvements to our homes. I also reread my letter to Joanne once a year, and I update that. I also ask myself if our wills are up to date with the current realities of our family and how I feel about life support, and if the funeral arrangements are as I want them. And then most importantly, whether or not I've laid it all out in a way that Joanne and her advisors can do the best possible job of carrying on, as I would have. And once again, what ought to be clear by now is that almost every question answered by the Crook Book could not be answered by reading your will or your trust. On the other hand, I admit there's nothing profound about having a Crook Book. Your estate plan is strategic, and the Crook Book is mostly tactical. Your estate plan answers the question of who will inherit your assets and how you'll allocate those assets. The Crook Book doesn't address that, but it is the vehicle that gets your estate plan done in the most effective way. And once you're no longer around, the fact is that having a Crook Book is really helpful to your spouse and your heirs and your trustee. So helpful that having one makes sense even if your estate is unlikely to incur an inheritance tax. And by the way, I've rewritten my letter to Joanne at least 5 times. I have one friend who reviews his every 30 days. Things change, and the Crook Book has to change with them. My Crook Book is a living thing, and it won't be done until I'm done. And it's my responsibility to keep it up to date. Joanne's letter to me is also up to date. My letter is maybe 98% about organization and 2% feelings. Joanne's letter to me is roughly 50-50. But still, she's very specific about how she wants some things handled in the months and years following her death. So I'll close by saying that over the years, many of my own friends have said to me that they have 80% of their Crook Book done. And I don't know why, but for some reason, the number is always 80%. When I hear that, I just smile to myself, because a Crook Book is much more than a set of unchanging documents. And I sure hope I've convinced you of that. And second, there is no such thing as an 80% Crook Book. Either yours is 100% as of this year, or you don't have a Croak book. So, thank you for listening. The rest of the time belongs to you, and it's available for Q&A. And let me add that Joanne is sitting right here next to me. So if anyone has a question that requires a spousal perspective, she'll do her best to answer that question.
Jim, do you feel that a non-experienced, non-attorney person can be an adequate executor of a semi-complicated estate?
Yeah, I definitely do, and I've done it 5 times.
Well, I have too. I've done it 3 times, and I maybe the difference was that the estates that I handled were not as well prepared as what yours were, but I found it very challenging. And
it is challenging, but I'd rather have someone as a trustee who cares about my family than someone who's doing it for a fee. And if you have someone in your family, or if there is someone in your family who can do that job, then I would vote to use that person, not a lawyer.
Okay, what I've seen the most effective is if you have a younger family member or a good friend of the family or something who is younger and an attorney, that to me that has worked out better.
Sure.
Because of the amount of work to be done on a complicated estate.
I think that's right. Any other questions? Any for Joanne?
Jim, this is Al. I'd like to add, we discussed, documents in safes or documents in safe deposit boxes. Our estate attorney, who's also a family attorney, and I'll get to one other issue. We've been gifting annually for 20 years, 25 years to our children, and utilizing partnerships, family partnerships, and therefore keeping values low. On a recent gift, our attorney said, do you want the original deeds, or do you want me to keep them in the firm safe? I never thought about that, and I said, why don't you keep all the original? I'll send you all the original deeds and keep copies so that when I croak, my trustee will know exactly where everything is, and in the case of fire or theft, your safe is much better than my safe. So we've turned over all our original deeds and documents to our legal firm that represents us and merely keep copies. So that's number one. The other thing I think Ron asked about art. I'd add jewelry to that. In my personal case, wine, all of which I don't own. My children own it, and they got it when they were very young, and they allow me to use it until my death and Kathy until her death, which is very kind of our children to allow us to use these things that they already own. But the art on our walls and the wine in our cellar and certain pieces of furniture, such as a baby grand, very old Steinway, are owned by our children. And if you're comfortable with that, it significantly lowers the value of your estate much sooner. So I'd pass that on to the group to deal with as they choose. But please write some sort of quote book, and please make it 100% complete, because there's no better gift you can give your spouse or your family or your siblings, or if everything's going to charity, even the charities you're giving it to.
Thank you, Al.
Jim, Ron Feinstein, one more question. the issue of denial of getting on with doing the Koch books is a common characteristic, I suspect. Have you thought about a mechanism that would reinforce getting the project done, if recognizing the project is a continuous journey, getting the project done through some other mechanism, some other third party, some other technique that would oversee increasing the probability that this would happen?
You know, because you're a good friend, I'd be happy to call you every 90 days.
That isn't what I had in mind.
I think it would work.
I'll call him, Jim. I'll call him. We'll alternate. I'll call him another every 90 days. That way, he gets and a third guy on the phone or woman will volunteer. He'll get a call once a month.
Even better.
I retract the question.
Oh, Ron, remember you need to do your Koch book.
Okay. Anything else, gang? Before we wrap this up?
I just have one comment, which is I thank you for putting this together originally. At some point, I actually wrangled my husband into doing this because we both track a lot of our financials, but the hardest part, and you all figured this out if you've attempted this, or at least the hardest part for us was the very last section. So, for whatever reason, nobody likes to kind of plan your funeral and talk about it. And it did take us a number of sessions to kind of kick that around. And I'm so glad we did, because I would have made a mistake relative to what he wanted. And anyway, that's just food or input for the rest of you. If you haven't gotten there yet, it may take a while.
Thank you.
Jim, Paul Robshaw again. Just hitchhiking on Debbie, I have put in mind, I don't like the idea of funerals because they're so sad. I wanted to have a celebration of life and to have a big party, and I put in my Koch book that my estate is to pay for the party. Just a suggestion.
Yep. Like it.
We like that. Joanne and I like that. Anybody else? Okay. Thank you all.
Thank you, Jim. Thanks
Thanks so much for doing this for us today. We obviously, from the questions and the attendance, it's a very relevant topic, but you handled it so well, and we can't thank you enough as a member taking the I won't say taking the bullet, but doing this for us. Thank you.
Okay. You're welcome, and good luck to all of you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Jim. Bye-bye.